This is Trend Following Radio, where great thinking comes alive. Nobel Prize winners, legendary traders, best-selling authors, and the pros that know what drive us irrational human beings. I am your host, MICHAEL COVEL. Not filtered, raw, honest. That's my passion. There is this great TED Talk by Simon Sinek. He ends up talking about Apple in this circle. I think he calls it this golden circle. You can go find the video. I'm not going to explain it to you. But about my author's work today, who I'm going to speak with, Simon has this to say about his book. It's the book for anyone who wants their work to last beyond their lifetime. We all don't think about that on a regular basis. But at some point in time, I think we all do think about it. I think about it now. What can I do that endures? What can I do that lasts? What can I do that goes on? I don't want to just be here in the here and now and go through the daily grind, pay the bills, and not leave a damn thing. That's no fun. How fun is that? That's just boring. And it's all in our power to leave a legacy. My guest today is Mark Miller. He is the author of Legacy in the Making, Building a Long-Term Brand in a Short-Term World. There you go. Right to the heart of the matter, right to what we all have to deal with in this ever-increasing short-term world. Where does legacy exist? Where does it come from? How can we develop it? Is it possible? And what are the big brands doing? What are the small brands doing? What are just great brands doing? Here's a tip. The great brands today, they're not static. They're legacies in the making. That's where you find endurance. I always love having interesting guests on that have lived experiences and perspectives that I've not had a chance to see firsthand. That's the joy of this podcast. To bring people on, I can jump into their head and boom, I learned something. Without any further delay, let's jump right into Mark Miller and discuss legacy in the making. So Mark, in prepping for you, I caught a name that I remember from a few years ago, and it was a TED video that I watched quite a bit. I was fascinated with it. I thought his explanation was just fabulous for how he tried to describe Apple computer. And he was at this flip chart board and he was writing with a magic marker. And this was the author Simon Sinek. And he was talking about this thing called the golden circle. And it was kind of funny. I see he's mentioned in your work, but I was thinking about him as I was going through your world and your work. And I was like, oh my gosh, it really does start with the why in many ways. What's your connection with Simon? Associates, friends? How do you guys connect?
It's a wonderful way to begin to tell the story of me in the book. And in actuality, Simon was neither a business contact nor a client. He was for me, as he was for you, someone that I had seen speak and give a TED Talk who I admired very much. And I happened to be researching and writing a piece for the book on a brand that I admired called Fast Company. I'd done an interview with Alan Weber, who was one of the co-founders of Fast Company, and he was telling me the story about how he began, him and his partner, William Taylor. They had observed a change in the way the work was being done in the world, not just domestically, but overseas. And in their observation, people were changing, culture was changing. Work wasn't just about profit anymore. Work was about doing things and taking things very personally. So I was inspired to think about running that model, that idea, through the work that Simon had done. And I reached out to him, told him about the book that I was writing, and was pleasantly surprised. It was a privilege that he returned the phone call. He felt that the subject of legacy, not as something that you'd put in a museum, but something that lives every day, was something that was understudied, underreported on, and something worth discussing. And yet he was a skeptic about whether the Fast Company story would in fact fit his model. So we got on the phone. It was early one morning. I was calling from LA. He was in New York. And I began by saying, well, let me tell you about the business that they built. And he cut me off immediately and said, I don't care about what they do. They're a magazine. Who cares? No one cares about the what. Tell me their origin story. And when I got into the story about how Alan and Bill had observed how work was changing, how that inspired them to write a manifesto about work for the modern age, he became a convert of sorts, certainly a fan and a believer. And that's how Simon and I met.
It is such a small world that I think once you reach the point, any individual reaches the point of confidence that they know they're on the cusp of something. It's amazing when you know, like, for example, your situation, when you're on the cusp of something, you know you're at the edge, all of a sudden you feel like, well, you know what? I should talk to Simon. He should talk to me. And it just happens. It just happens, right?
I was amazed, inspired. It was a privilege. And as you said, had I never been talking about the subject, researching, writing, I'm not sure I would have had the confidence to reach out. But yes, that in fact is what inspired me to reach out. And he reciprocated. And he's been an amazing champion and fan of the work.
Let me lay out a scenario that I've been seeing a lot in the last 5 years, because I think it's the polar opposite of where we're going to go in our conversation today. I've seen a lot of young people, specifically, let's say, a lot of programming types, optimization types, people that have figured out with the current structure of the internet, they can arbitrage or frankly hack the system. And what I mean by that is they can create a brand, they can figure out the response rate, refigure the ad charges, and they can make a very profitable business that they can perhaps then sell or just spins off cash. I also know multi-billion-dollar businesses that are living this way. They basically just figure out, how do I get my needed response rate to make a profit, and then that's it. The soul is just not there. Now, but these are very successful businesses. It's very counter to where your work is going. Do you see some of this today where here you are making this case about legacy, but then I'm looking at all these people that I've met and seen that are making a lot of money, which ultimately is a judge for many people. You know, I'm making a lot of money. And they're not doing anything that you're talking about. They're kind of completely going the opposite direction. Now, to me, I think it's very short term, and it can be fleeting, and it could all implode in any moment. I don't like it personally, but I sure see a lot of people going that way.
I have the same observation, and to be totally transparent, I make no judgment that people motivated to make a living, to take care of their family, to climb the corporate ladder, it's right for some. It's not right for me. It's not what motivated my research. It certainly reflected how I grew up. I went to business school. I was motivated by many of the same things. But I think the old world point of view was you could make money or you could make a contribution in the world, and never shall the two intersect. And what I found was actually, when you think about it from the opposite point of view, when you think about making a contribution, you can actually make an incredibly good living and be incredibly profitable by making contribution ahead of thinking about how much money you're going to make. That making money can be an outcome, not the primary driver. I've seen those same people who do quite nicely for themselves, and yet I've chosen to study people who live and work in a fundamentally different way.
Well, if we look at some of the people that have also found that economic success, I have seen some to where they get the money and they've got nothing else.
That's right.
They've got the money, but then they don't have the interaction with peers. They don't have the collaboration. They don't have the connection. They don't have something that's theirs, a topic that inspires them on a daily basis. They don't have any of that. They just have the money. And it's a lonely, lonely space. And I'm seeing it a lot more these days.
I would say there's the personal dissatisfaction that can come later in life, as you describe, where you feel like you're financially rich in some respect, but the richness in life is missing. I think that's a reality. Equally, I see those people who just say, I work inside of an ad agency. That's a fact. I work inside of a place called Team One. We work with very large brands, including two that we discussed in the book, one called Lexus and one called Ritz-Carlton. It's not uncommon that we see people walk through our doors on a daily basis who say, my business objective is grow a company and sell it for $1 billion. I would be financially well off and I feel I would be satisfied, and that's great. When you ask them what their 5-year plan is or 10-year plan, they just don't have it. They don't have the foresight to think that they'll be emotionally bankrupt or emotionally not rich. They just think about, as you say, the short-term win. And I'm simply more drawn and attracted to the ones who say, my 5-year plan, my 10-year plan is to make a difference culturally, socially, maybe via technology that changes or improves the way we all live. And I'm going to make a lot of money doing it as well. But money is an outcome. And for me, as I said, I went through a personal moment of transformation where I used to chase growth on a corporate ladder and financial gain. And there were just things that transpired in my life that caused me to say, I think I can do both. I don't think it has to be a sacrifice.
Let's stay at the example that you just mentioned, something that you discuss in the book. Readers will have to go in and dig in more inside the book, but you mentioned Lexus, you mentioned Ritz-Carlton. An interesting scenario, I want you to lay it out, but essentially two very, very successful brands. I mean, if one doesn't know about the brand Lexus or the brand Ritz-Carlton, maybe you've not got much out of the cabin in the woods in the Ozarks somewhere for a long time. And that's fair enough. That could be a great life somewhere in the cabin in the Ozarks. I'm not condemning, but they're two fabulous brands. But they have very different outlooks on their current status, or they have had. Lexus has been around 25 years or so, or Ritz-Carlton 30 or so. And one thinks they're too young and one thinks they're too old. And I should be quiet and let you explain it.
It's amazing. And it was core to the inspiration for researching and writing this book. And it goes almost exactly as you described. I started researching and doing the start of my writing in and around 2012. Lexus was getting ready to turn 25 years old, and the Ritz-Carlton Hotel Company was getting ready to turn 30 years old. And Lexus looked at the world and said, 25 years is too young to remark upon the milestone that BMW and Mercedes both have been around much longer. We are concerned that if we celebrate our success, that they will say, don't celebrate how far you've come. You should be concerned about how far you still have to go. When you get to be our age, that's when you should celebrate. Ritz-Carlton saw it exactly the other way. Better to be the brand new anything than the 30-year-old hotel company. In the United States, there was a brand called the Cosmopolitan that had launched in around that period. It was cool, it was trendy, it was talked about, and there was the perception that maybe it was better to be in their shoes than to be the Ritz-Carlton. And yet, exactly as you said, who wouldn't want to launch a company and be successful like Lexus 25 years later, or launch a company and be successful like the Ritz-Carlton 30 years later? And that drew me in part to want to explore what it meant to be at a certain age, time, place, and history. And full transparency, the company that I work at, the ad agency, Team One, was getting ready to turn 25 years old. And again, a very successful company. And yet the ad industry was changing all around us. New technologies, new data sources. At 25 years old, I guess we weren't exactly the new kids on the block anymore, and yet we were born in a modern age. I will add into the mix that I was about to become a dad for the first time. And I had a personal concern and or preoccupation that my daughter would grow up wondering what her dad was doing other than working his life away, making money, but to what end? And all of those elements, ingredients, motivated me to study yet again time, place, history, and doing things that were not just temporarily successful, but successful for many years to come.
So you've had a chance to see behind the curtain a little bit at a couple of these brands that us mere mortals will not have the chance to see. So we're talking Lexus, we're talking Ritz-Carlton, we're talking two different perspectives. Now, each perspective, it's not like one is necessarily right or wrong, and there gets to become nuances and complexities. But what can we take away from those different perspectives that we can all look at our own lives and our own businesses? What have you seen behind the scenes with those perspectives that they have that we can take away?
In the book, we detail sort of the 5 overarching lessons, principles. We refer to it as the modern legacy mindset, how those who succeed for today, tomorrow, and always look at moving through the world. And effectively, the principles break down like this. If old world thinkers, if short-term thinkers begin the conversation with how much money can I make? How do I maximize shareholder revenue? These modern legacy thinkers think in terms of personal contribution, personal ambition. What difference will they make today, tomorrow, and always for the long term? And that's ahead of making money. We tell a beautiful story about the guys at Tribeca Film Festival who said the world didn't need another film festival, but Tribeca needed the Tribeca Film Festival because it helped to bring a city back to vitality in the aftermath of the 9/11 attacks in New York. The second principle that we talk about is if old world thinkers and short-term thinkers only prioritize building empires, the modern legacy thinkers think in terms of behaving their beliefs. They put culture first, internal culture first. And Ritz-Carlton's a beautiful example of a brand that says, It's not the buildings that they construct. It's the people, the ladies and gentlemen who populate those buildings that animate what that brand is all about. The third principle is not just about growing customers. It's ironic in a way, it's funny in a way that we refer to customers as targets. Like all we want to do is put a bullseye on them and go after them. The modern legacy thinkers anticipate and build with the idea of letting outsiders in. We don't just sell at consumers, we create, we co-create, we collaborate, we make them a part of the story in the making. The fourth principle is about not just leading in categories, but about leading in external culture. Not just being the best at what you do, but being the only ones who do it, playing your own game. And the fifth and final principle is about not just pursuing 15 minutes of fame, but is predicated upon the notion of never stop making legacy. You don't do things once that are infamous or famous. You do things each and every day where you add to your story, you add to your history in the making. You never stop making legacy. So those are the 5 sort of governing principles of the book.
I want to take you through a bunch of examples. I want to start with something with Ritz-Carlton, and I want you to elaborate and explain a story that took place in Dubai with a small boy. But before we get to that, I want to kind of get past something along that I saw with Ritz-Carlton. And the point that you really make in your work is about the employees being empowered. So years ago, I was at a Southern California Ritz-Carlton right there on the water, a little south of LA, Marina del Rey, Playa del Rey, I can't remember. But anyways, I was sitting there with a fund manager, and he's quite successful. He wasn't being arrogant or anything like the sort, but he called a young staff member over, and we were just sitting there, and he said he gave the young staff member his Starbucks order. And the Ritz-Carlton staff person said, well, sir, we don't have a Starbucks here. And the fund manager reached into his wallet and gave the guy a $100 bill and repeated his order. And the staff member said, well, sir, I'll go get that for you. But it was an incentive, but I think the staff member still would have figured it out without the incentive. But it was kind of a great example for me just to kind of see, okay, let's be flexible here. Let's be nimble. Let's make something happen for somebody that wants something to happen. Why don't you tell your story, though? Because I thought it was a really, and perhaps the larger principles that you pulled from it, but the Dubai story I thought was really, really nice.
So the Ritz-Carlton appears in the second chapter, which is principally about brands and leaders that behave their beliefs. We've all seen the stories of brands who write beautiful words in their external communication. They write manifestos. They have posters on their internal walls that say, at this company, we stand for X, or at this company, we believe Y. And the vast majority of times, when confronted with difficult circumstances, you find those organizations, companies, and leaders kind of behave antithetical to how they say that they should, how their culture prescribes that they should. And yet the Ritz-Carlton is a company that entirely behaves around their beliefs. They hire that way. As I said, they're ladies and gentlemen who serve ladies and gentlemen. The language they use is differentiating, but the culture that they live is differentiating. In fact, they meet at every property around the world each day in something that they call their lineup, where they talk about a value that they care about and an example that they bring to life. Their examples live sort of what they call a wow moment, a wow story, to show that when faced with an unusual circumstance, not just because the rules require it, but because their culture sort of insists upon it, how do they respond instinctually in these moments? So they meet for 50 minutes every day. They talk about the value. They share a story. And one of the stories that they would have shared is the one that we talk about in the book. And that is a family shows up in Dubai, and they show up with a young boy who's in a wheelchair who remarks that he wishes he could swim in the ocean. And yet the distance from the hotel to the ocean is incredibly far. It's not just a short walk. The reality, as I said, is the boy had never had the opportunity to swim in the ocean, and yet an industrious, entrepreneurial, culture-subscribing Ritz-Carlton lady or gentleman overhears the boy wishing for this, and without literal instruction, takes it upon himself to build a bridge, a physical bridge using wood to get from the hotel to the ocean. It's as if a wish was granted, a wow comes to life. A boy is able to be moved in his wheelchair from the hotel down to the ocean, and a lady or gentleman from the property is able to take that boy and actually transport him from his chair into the water. And as if by magic, that happens. Now, there are no literal rules that say that must happen. There's simply a culture that says when given the opportunity to make magic come to life, you do it. And they did it. There's another really cool story in the book about a young boy who leaves his stuffed giraffe behind at a hotel. Family goes home, young boy goes berserk that he left his animal behind, and they call the hotel, and what does the Ritz-Carlton do? Rather than simply finding it and returning it, they take the animal on a tour of the property. They take the giraffe to the pool, the giraffe to the spa, the giraffe to the beach. They photograph it and document it, and by the time they send the animal home, they reassure the boy and the family that, well, you've been separated. Your animal wasn't in ruins or disrepair. He was given a wonderful vacation as well. And that's what you do when you assign and subscribe to culture. It's amazing.
Those wow stories, and especially the one with the young boy in the wheelchair, it makes me think about how so many people will respond to a situation. So here you have the situation where most people would think, well, gosh, it'd be great to get the young boy to the ocean, but my gosh, building a deck that could cost thousands of dollars, right? That could take a lot of time to hire a contractor really quick or whatever. Now, of course, the Ritz-Carlton can afford it, but by understanding this wow concept, they realize, okay, we do this, we create the wow in the individual, and that virality of creating the wow experiences has to produce on an order of magnitude of value, a dollar value that far exceeds the construction cost of a few planks of wood to get to the ocean.
When the U.S. economy went to bad and we had the recessionary years, the most successful brand within the Marriott portfolio was the Ritz-Carlton. Now, by conventional standards, consumers do not need to spend premiums to go stay at that brand or those hotels. If you simply want to go on vacation and get the lowest cost experience, you would find lower cost rooms in similar locations. But as you say, when you espouse your beliefs, when you live your culture, when you make magic happen for people, for those who can afford to take those kind of vacations, why wouldn't you always choose it? Life is short, time is limited. You might as well live your life collecting memories that'll stay with you and stories that you can pass along. And the Ritz-Carlton does it beautifully. As you say, if you lead with how much will this cost us, you would never build a deck from the hotel to the water and get the kid in the ocean. It takes time and it takes money. But when your culture says create wows, create memories that last a lifetime, don't just think about welcoming consumers to a hotel, but think about sending them away with stories that last a lifetime. You behave differently. And that's the difference.
I'll give you a great example outside of your work, just an experience of mine. I'll let you comment on it. I spend a lot of time in Asia. When I fly to the States, I'm invariably flying on ANA Airlines, and I'm usually making a stop in Tokyo. They're great for getting back and forth to the States. I now exclusively, I'll never fly economy, not because I'm some stuck-up guy and I want to spend a lot of money, but I have learned that if I spend the $4,000 to $5,000 that it's going to cost me business class for ANA, I literally will pay that for the service, number one, and number two, for the food. It's some of the best Japanese food, 5, 6 courses, who the heck knows? But now that I've had that experience of that particular level, the money doesn't even come into my head. It's like, I will do this because the experience is so nice.
We began this conversation talking about Simon Sinek. One of his often repeated expressions is, people don't just buy what you make, they buy what you believe. Whether it's the Ritz-Carlton example, whether it's your ANA example, these are brands who believe something so strongly that they create things not because it costs the least, but because it espouses what they believe in. And the consumer experience of it is wonderful. And these are stories that we pass forward. And you require consumers passing stories forward for brands to stay vital for years to come. We can't just put our arms around brands and think that we own them as marketers. We have to invite consumers into the equation and make them ambassadors and evangelists for the things that they hold dear and we hold dear. And that's how stories live on.
I won't go too far that direction, but I mentioned an Asian carrier, and a lot of carriers outside, at least air carriers outside of the States, have really ramped up their game in the last bunch of years. Unfortunately, we don't have a lot of what I would see in your work taking place across the airlines. And I think sometimes it's unfortunate when you have businesses that have monopoly power and they really don't have to do anything because they know they've got you. That's unfortunate.
That's an astute observation. I think that's an important observation. I think hotel industry is one of those industries that's looking for innovation, invention. And to be fair, we saw it in the hotel category too. There was a certain point in time where hotels were more interested in incremental improvement. One hotel gives you 12 pillows, one hotel gives you 13 pillows. And what comes out of that experience is a brand like Airbnb comes along and fundamentally reinvents how people move through the world and how they travel. You would like to think that brands would motivate themselves to aim higher and push further, but every once in a while we will see brands show up in a category and force innovation and change, and perhaps airline may be one of those spaces.
It'd be nice. I hope it comes. Hey, let me go back to an example that you brought up briefly earlier, because I think it's a great one. And I'm sure that for people not familiar with it, what you said was not enough to explain it. The Tribeca Film Festival. This was not started. I mean, there's Sundance, there's Cannes. The Tribeca Film Festival started not too long after 9/11. Another film festival. I've actually thought this before I even saw your work. I thought to myself, what was the point? There was like just another film festival. But that wasn't why they got started or how they got started in any way, shape, or form. It had nothing to do with film, from my understanding.
Full disclosure, and it sounds like you're in the same boat, I love film. I'm originally from Toronto, Canada. I grew up at the Toronto Film Festival, loved it. It was incredibly meaningful and important to the city. And when I eventually moved to the United States and tracked the emergence and rise of other festivals, I had a similar response, which is, why does the world need something like this? And I guess more to the point, I was skeptical. I don't think the world needs more film festivals. There are plenty already to choose from, including Toronto and Cannes and Sundance and so forth. And yet when I sat down with Craig Hatkoff, one of the three co-founders, he repeated a phrase that I'd said earlier, which is, it's true, the world did not need another film festival, but Tribeca needed what we were doing. And the story goes exactly like this. Three co-founders, Rosenthal, Hatkoff, De Niro, New Yorkers, either involved in the film industry directly and or passionate about it by virtue of just being a fan in the case of Craig's case. And of course, having been married to Jane, it was in his blood, it was in his family. They originally responded to 9/11 not with a film festival, but with something called Dinner Downtown. As people who grew up in that part of the world, they said those with the means to spend need to go out and be customers of, for example, local restaurants, because if we don't, those businesses will go out of business and a city in disrepair will go further in ruin. And so they came up with a program where they said, we're going to go out for dinner. We're going to invite our friends to come. They have to invite 10 friends to come with them. And let's see what happens. And before you knew it, you had the president at the time coming out, celebrities coming out, people, as I said, with means reinvesting in the city. And that motivated Hatkoff, De Niro, and Rosenthal to say, well, let's take something not just that we happen to be passionate about, food, but something that we're also really good at, which is creating film, populating the world with film. Take something we love, something we're good at, and fill the world with something it needs. And that is taking care of the city that we grew up in. And that's how they created it. And it was an amazing success, not just because it was a film festival, but because of what it stood for.
That's very similar to that example when I think of Simon Sinek's golden circle, golden rule, where, he's kind of saying, we're Apple, we have this belief set. Oh, by the way, we make cool products.
Exactly.
Oh, by the way, we were going to do a film festival. We got these groups of people together. We have fun at dinner. Oh, by the way, let's do a film festival.
It's exactly right. And today, if you hear the co-founders talk about what they've built, whether film stays in the title or not is to be determined over time. It's really the Tribeca Festival. It's a cultural festival of which film is a primary component that'll never go away, but it's actually grown and evolved. And that's important because if they literally did the festival the way they did it so many years ago and never changed and never evolved, it too would risk a question around relevance over time.
Well, that's a word that's common in your book, evolve. So even the established players, the established traditions, figuring out how that evolution shall unfold is quite tricky. It's quite interesting. For example, here's a good one from your work. Wimbledon, right? So many traditions, but this notion of a roof over top the court. This caused a lot of angst, a lot of strife, but it's a good evolution for their tradition. Would that be a fair assessment?
Yes. As I love film, I love tennis. Wimbledon, for any tennis fan, is sort of the pinnacle of what tennis is all about. In their own words, they would say some version of their ambition was to always put the world's best tennis on display. They have some traditions that they've hung on to for years, like the players wear all whites. There's a reason for that, because they think the world's best tennis players need to distinguish themselves with their skill and ability, not with their dress. They think yellow clothes, flashy clothes, red clothes has nothing to do with your ability to hit a great forehand or backhand. That's a fashion statement. That's not a statement about your tennis game. And so all whites is meant to say, put the focus on the skill and ability. And yet, if you want the world's best tennis, weather has the ability to impact. If it rains, you don't get the world's best tennis, you get no tennis. So whereas some of the traditionalists would say, do not mess with the structure of the court, if you think about what we're trying to build, what they're trying to build over a lifetime, get the world's best tennis out on the court, then of course a retractable roof makes sense because it allows the game to continue. And yet, tremendous discussion did not happen easily.
There's so many great case studies. I'm going to pepper you with a few more that I really love. But as I think about the case studies, and I think about one of the things that you've done in the book, the conventions, you keep establishing the kind of establishment date of the company, many examples going back a long time, 100 years. But what's interesting about that is you also make the point in this day and age, the average lifespan of a company is shrinking. So you've got established companies that can reinvent themselves, go in new directions. But what are we to make of new companies that are coming along with clearly the research, the data is showing the average lifespan of companies are shrinking?
It's one of the facts that we state early in the book. We talk about the average lifespan of a company in the S&P 500. And in 1920, about 100 years ago, it was 67 years. And today it's more like 15 years. And you don't have to go very far. You don't have to dig very deep to see the companies that we thought would never go away just seem to keep getting themselves in trouble. This year alone, Toys R Us, bankruptcy, Gibson Guitars, bankruptcy, Radio Shack, Sears, bankruptcy, and more. I think there is absolutely a burning platform that says if you're a startup organization and you care to be around for any period of time, really, that you have to think more long-term than simply get the company off the ground today. And so you see us talk about brands like Girls Who Code, started in 2012, or Jessica Alba's Honest Company, started in 2012, or Bono's brand, a Red, started in 2006. As you can appreciate, when you write a book that has legacy in the title, people think you're only talking about brands that are 100 years old. And ours are brands that are 10 years and younger, 100 years and older, and everything in between. So if I were to pick a brand like Honest Company, I think that's an amazing story about a category that never saw them coming. They sold in a different way. The price points were different. The bundling strategy was different. They're a CPG company, but they're a CPG company that said they have a higher purpose than just selling a lot of stuff. Jessica Alba has young kids. She was concerned about the chemicals she was going to be putting on those kids. So she teamed up with some co-founders who had knowledge and skill about how to be good to your body, how to take care of yourself, how to be gentle to human beings, and also creating a very profitable company. She was on the front page of basically every business journal at the time for the success she created immediately out of the gate. And she created a lot of havoc and turmoil for the classic CPG companies that had to change the way they would do business. It's no longer acceptable to just make a lot of money if you're a conventional CPG. You have to think about being sustainable. You have to think about being good to the customers that you care for. And it can't just be lip service. I love that she didn't just start out with, how do I get my billion-dollar unicorn? She started out with, how do I make a difference in the lives of my kids? Because by the way, I think that might make a difference in the lives of your kids too.
You know, this making the difference, one of the things that I think sometimes we all, we get caught up in the notion of proprietary. Everything's proprietary. Keep it in-house. Keep the secrets, right? You've got a great example in the book, a great case study about the San Diego Zoo. Now, I must say, I've spent a lot of time in San Diego. And I don't know, I'm going to let you explain some of the details and background, but just from a big overview standpoint, I don't know that I will ever go to another zoo again. Okay. I think if I want to go to a zoo, I go to San Diego. If I don't want to go to a zoo, I don't go. I mean, it's either San Diego Zoo or no zoo. That might sound a little crazy, but I think when you go to the San Diego Zoo, you walk away and you would be saying, Mike, I know why you're saying that. But going through your work, I start to understand that on the surface, I can walk through that zoo, that park, and I can just say, my gosh, so much attention to detail. But that's on I'm just the guy walking through skin deep. Behind the scenes, what they're doing though is amazing. I guess it doesn't necessarily surprise me that something that looks so good on the front end, that the back end is doing some amazing work as well. And the sharing of their amazing work is part of the secret of their success.
Absolutely. I love the way you begin the story, because I think conventional marketing, certainly short-term thinking, says you come up with an exceptional product or service and you keep it secret as long as you can. and you try to control the conversation and tell consumers what to do, how to do it, and so on. And yet it's a contemporary idea, and it's one of the ingredients of long-lasting companies that they invite consumers in, that they don't just think about their own well-being, they think about sharing. I'll get to the San Diego Zoo very quickly, but by way of example, there was a very famous Mercedes case study where an interviewer had asked them, Mercedes, you had invented crash testing automobiles. Yes. You took out a patent on the technology. Yes. But today, every automotive company around the world does crash testing with dummies. Yeah, that's also true. Well, why did you not reinforce the patent? And the response was, because some things are too important to keep to ourselves. And in that one moment with that response, what they told the world was, we innovated something. Credit for that. And we know that some things are more important than hoarding innovations to ourselves. So they were a leader in the innovation, and now they're a thought leader in culture and society as well. And the San Diego Zoo lives in exactly the same world. They were very concerned about being what they would say is the last zoo standing. That we live and operate in a time where some families and some people love going to zoos, but some people think that zoos are bad places. They're not places that should be visited. They're not animals in their natural habitat. And what they want people to understand is they're not just a place that puts animals on display because they're for show. They're actually deeply involved in trying to make extinction, in a sense, a thing of the past. They're trying to find ways to sustain species, revive species in some cases. The story they like to tell is about the pandas, which is most countries were taking pandas effectively on short-term loan from China, take them for more like 2 years at a time. The problem is because no one had really figured out how to breed them successfully, that bringing animals over for 2 years was simply too short a period of time to understand how to help them breed, procreate, and live on. So not because they had to, but because they wanted to make a difference, the San Diego Zoo asked for a longer-term commitment, multiple years, more like 10 years and onwards. Their commitment in return to China was to share everything that they learned. And they're now at the point where pandas are breeding, and pandas are more likely to come out in their natural habitat in China. Something that we thought would be years in the making is now much closer to being a reality because a zoo took the high-minded point of view to say, we're not doing this simply for ourselves, we're doing it for the betterment of humanity, society, for zoos everywhere. And that's an amazing difference.
The panda story, I have to say something, I don't know if this is necessarily negative, but I grew up in the Washington, D.C. area. So in the late 70s, early 80s, I can't remember when they got the panda for the first time. They had a pair there. And my gosh, it was this saga for the longest time. And I don't know if they ever had success, but it was like literally every couple years, the poor panda on the rock slab would kick out a stillborn pup. And, we watched this for eons, and you say to yourself, my gosh, something seems wrong here. And it's like, okay, you take these poor animals that come from the forest of China, these huge bamboo forests, and we put them on a rock in Washington, D.C. and say, have babies. And it didn't exactly work.
When I think about the good and the bad, and clearly there is a debate, there are two sides. And as someone who grew up loving animals and still loves animals, I understand the side that says this is not animals in their natural habitat. What is the good that comes out of it? But when I hear the other piece about the contributions made through learning to sustaining species, I take something very positive out of that. And what drives me further, what motivates me further, is the notion that they don't just sit there and say, how do we get more consumers to come through the gates? They think about how do we create more pandas in the world all around us. I relate to the ambition. I love what they're trying to do.
I absolutely do too. I think my point was more, and of course there's, when you have these kinds of case studies, you invariably end up making comparisons. But again, as I said from the top, I will go to one zoo. I will not go to other zoos, and I'll just leave it at that and try to be nice about it. But San Diego Zoo is amazing. I think we could both agree to that. And if somebody wants to take their kids, whether they live in the States or not live in the States, and they want to go to a zoo for a first time, you can't go wrong in San Diego. That's a fair assessment, right?
Absolutely. Absolutely.
So listen, I got one last one I kind of want to drive through, is a great example and kind of a shift gears. Full disclosure, I don't really drink anymore. I might have a beer every 6 months. I just don't really drink. But I can safely say there was a point in time in my life where myself and my male friends in teenage years would have a bottle of Jägermeister in the freezer. And that stuff was poison. And basically, I don't know if there's anything in it besides alcohol, but it sure seemed like that when Jägermeister was consumed, crazy, you know what would happen. I don't know why. Maybe we believed it was a placebo effect. Who knows? But it sure seemed like Jägermeister was crazy stuff. So the guy behind Jägermeister, though, ends up being a character in your book, which is something that I really relate to, which is how can I be the only person doing what I'm doing? And I'm speaking about a guy named Sidney Frank, and I want to lead into a story about vodka. But I don't know if there's anything you want to take from what I've said so far.
I myself am not a big drinker, and I found myself drawn to the story for exactly what you had pointed out, which is people who took a fundamentally different point of view to not play by category rules, but effectively change category rules. And this is a story about a brand that launched in 1997.
Grey Goose Vodka.
Grey Goose Vodka. And what they effectively did, so Sidney Frank and his collaborator, Francois Thibault, who's still attached to the brand today. Francois came from sort of a classic winemaking, spirits making background. And you have to appreciate that vodka was not exactly top of the shelf at the time. In fact, the point of vodka was effectively to be tasteless. It was the thing that would support another flavor, support another drink, but it wasn't the primary ingredient. It wasn't the key recipe. And Sidney had a point of view about changing the way the category worked. And it didn't come from saying, how do I imitate the one to the left or to the right? It came from just saying, I think I can create something fundamentally new here. He brings the craft of proper winemaking over by virtue of Francois Thibault. And they create a recipe that never exists and an approach to vodka that never existed until this time about creating a taste, a flavor for vodka. In fact, the hallmark for this brand's success was they received an accolade out of the gate, which was the world's best tasting vodka, and effectively created a business based on doing something that no one had ever done before by reframing the problem, reframing the category. I loved your language. It's something that we talk about in the book, which is don't just be the best at what you do, be the only ones who do it. And as a consequence of adding taste to a category that was otherwise tasteless, they reframed everything.
But it's still tasteless, isn't it?
Well, if you're a vodka aficionado, I think they would say they could discern the difference. And more so, they've actually introduced real flavor into the experience, and they continue to do so today. So it's not a purely tasteless experience.
Can I stay there for a moment? Because I think there's something a little bit interesting about what they're doing there. It sure seems like to introduce vodka as taste and beyond the flavors. Gin, I understand. Okay, gin has a multitude of different tastes, and I can see the spirit designer there. There's so many variation, but vodka truly tastes like nothing. Okay, so, but I think there's a real brilliance in that, though, too. It's okay, I think, if your customers want to go there with you. If you say, "Hey, I'm going to create this exclusive kind of like high-end product. No one's ever done it before." They charge twice as much per bottle of typical vodka, I think, something like that. And then to say this tastes better. And I guess if your clientele, if your customers want to go along with you and everyone believes in it, it's not much different than looking at, Versace or Burberry or something like that, right? It's a designer brand. It's a luxury brand. There's nothing wrong with that if your customers are going along the ride with you.
I think it's a yes and. The credentials for the brand here come heavily from Francois and his pedigree. So I think if this was strictly a marketing construct, I think if they were self-proclaimed the best tasting vodka, I think they would have found themselves in a world of trouble. The idea that you could succeed with artifice alone and marketing alone, I think, is discordant with the fact that Frank, the master marketer, actually went out and got himself the master distiller. And is discordant with the fact that he didn't just pay for ads that said, "I think we've made the best." It's an actual institute allowed them to say it. So I think it's fair to say that sometimes the differences between brands seemed more nuanced than clearly differentiated. And yet, having substance to prove it, to back up the things you say, are materially important. I don't think you can just show up in the world and say, we're going to tell the world we're different. I think you need to have some substance to it or it falls apart at some point.
It's a fascinating example, really. I mean, I'm sure, look, we've seen a lot of different, since they've come out. I think they've inspired a lot of other designer labels. I don't know their success compared to, I think was it George Clooney and a tequila brand, I think? I mean, there's been a huge number of people that have probably seen the Grey Goose model and said, well, we can do that too, right?
In virtually every story, in virtually every category that we cover, the risk of all this is you do something that's famous once and you get a series of folks who copy. And if your key to success is strictly that you're the best, you're 5% better, you're 10% better, you're going to find that's not a recipe for success. That's sort of the driver of you have to do something that's fundamentally different, and you have to be willing to evolve over time, not just repeat literally the steps of the past, because you'll be copied and imitated. Technology brands who put their arms around the latest innovation because they're afraid they'll be copied, they should be afraid. They will be copied fast and more cheaply. And yet you have a company like Apple that succeeds not strictly because they have the best technology, but because they've engendered the fascination of an audience that believes like they do, who believe in doing things differently.
I don't buy anything except Apple, okay? In my mind, I don't know that they don't have the best. I tend to assume they do have the best everything, and I have no idea what anybody else is doing. That's how good their marketing has been for me. I've been using the products for 30 years, but I don't even know what anybody else is doing.
Simon Sinek tells a beautiful story that brings this example to life. The story that he tells is he goes at one point in time and speaks to an audience at Microsoft, and to say thank you for his speech, they give him what was at the time their media player, a Zune. Zune, of course, not particularly successful over time.
Was it Zune or Zoom? I don't even know. Was it Zune?
I believe it was Zune, and the fact that you don't know, and the fact that I'm even questioning it, is just the reality of they did not create the world beater, but functionally, maybe a better product, design-wise, maybe a better product. So Simon gets the gift. Shortly thereafter, he goes and speaks to an Apple audience. And what he offers up is he wants to stir the pot. So he tells the organizers at Apple afterward, hey, I want to let you know I was at Microsoft last week. And they said, okay. He said, yeah, and they gave me their product. It was Zune. It was beautiful. In fact, I think it was better than your iPod. He said they had a big smile on their face, and they said, yeah, we have no doubt. And he said he was confused for a moment. He just told their competitor made a functionally better product, a product that was designed more beautifully. And they nodded, saying, I would not be surprised if that's true. And he said, as he thought about it over time, what came to him was because they were playing a fundamentally different game. Microsoft was benchmarking against other products in the category and tried to do slightly better. Apple was trying to create change in the way people use technology in their lives. Didn't matter if Microsoft's was 1% better or 5% better. Apple was going to change the way people consumed and used their products. And it was a bigger purpose and a bigger ambition that would last longer than this year's sales. And for me, that's a lovely example to say, if you're in the business to be simply leader in a category, short-term success. If you're in the business of creating cultural change, social improvement, cultural impact, you have the possibility of lasting a much longer time.
You know, a great example of that, since we're making comparisons, and of course, Bill Gates has done a lot of great work. The company has made a tremendous amount of money. The legacy is set forever. But to make comparisons and to keep this kind of Apple Microsoft thing going on, which has been going on for a long time, I was just in Singapore, and the Apple store there is just rocking and rolling, right? It's just completely packed. But you know, if you go to any mall these days, you'll see somewhere in the corner of the mall is the empty Microsoft store that looks like a cheap knockoff of the Apple store. And you just shake your head after all these years, and all the money and capital that Microsoft has, that all they can think to do is to say, well, Apple's got this store. Maybe if we put a store in the same mall, we'll get the same success. It's completely missing the boat.
I agree.
Yeah. You've got to be careful here. I don't have all these clients. I could just say anything. But it's true though. Like, the reason that everyone's in the Apple store is not because it's just a store in the mall.
I entirely agree. And it sparks a thought for me, which is, I don't know if we'll end here, but I'll use the Lexus story as a bit of a bookend, because we talked about Ritz-Carlton and Lexus early on. There was no need for another luxury automotive company in the beginning when Lexus introduced itself in and around 1989. People's emotional needs were satisfied. People's product needs were satisfied. I had plenty of automotive choices. If they took the approach of copying and imitating, it was a recipe for failure. They built a fundamentally different model. They focused on things that other automotive companies had not focused on to that point. They catered to a consumer that was under service. You could have looked at the category and said it was saturated and walked away, but instead they said, let's move the category. It's what Tribeca did too. World didn't need another film festival, but Tribeca did. So I don't think we should look at categories and say, saturated, we don't belong. I love the idea of saying, what's something that you do really well, something you love, something you're good at, something the world needs more of. And because they need more of it, it's something that people will pay you money for. If you can walk through those basic filters, I think that's a recipe, partially a recipe for long-term success.
And in full disclosure, I have at various points in time, I think I was a Lexus owner for like 15 years. And I gave my last Lexus to my father, and he still thinks it's the greatest thing since sliced bread, even though it's like 12 years old. He's like, oh, my thing runs great. It runs awesome. He thinks it's fabulous. They make great stuff. You know, it kept me for a long time. I would surely consider going the Lexus direction again. Anyways, I'm off on a tangent. The book, Legacy in the Making, building a long-term brand to stand out in a short-term world. It's definitely a short-term world. Mark, you give great insights. I enjoy the conversation. I really wish you best of luck. Any website we can send people to check things out? I mean, the book is Amazon and all that kind of fun stuff, but any website you'd like to direct people to?
If you go to thelegacylab.com, THELEGACY, lab.com, you can learn a lot more about our research there.
Mark, I appreciate you taking the time today.
Thank you, Michael. Appreciate it.
I see a time when those awake will understand how to make money in up, down, and surprise markets. Whether new trader or experienced, college student or financial advisor, protecting against a crash or just trying to make a lot of money, trend following offers everyone an answer in uncertain times. To get started immediately, send me an email, michael@covel.com. I will send you the right trend following steps to take along with my free video. But if you want to buy and hold, trust the government and trust Wall Street, this is absolutely not for you.